The pristine facade of suburban perfection shattered not with a dramatic crash, but with the silent, insidious glow of a smartphone screen on a Tuesday afternoon. September 17th, to be exact, a day that promised nothing more than another sun-drenched, meticulously manicured existence in Scottsdale, Arizona. Margot Thorne, a woman whose life as an interior designer was built on precision and aesthetic harmony, suddenly found her own carefully constructed reality reduced to a chaotic, ugly mess. It began, as many modern tragedies do, with a tiny piece of technology, an AirTag, innocently tucked into Julian Croft's golf bag. He, my husband of 12 years, a man whose charm could sell sand in the desert, had apparently redefined community service to include intimately serving the HOA treasurer's wife. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, far more potent than the artisanal coffee I'd been sipping moments before. My name is Margot Thorne, and at 40 years old, I believed I had a firm grasp on the narrative of my life. My home, a testament to tasteful minimalism and understated luxury, mirrored the image I projected: composed, successful, and utterly in control. Julian, 42, with his dazzling, almost predatory smile and a real estate empire built on handshakes and hollow promises, was the charismatic counterpoint to my quiet strength. We were the quintessential power couple of our exclusive gated community, raising two bright children, Leo, 10, and Chloe, 8, in a world where the biggest concerns usually revolved around lawn maintenance standards or the precise shade of beige for the community clubhouse. Our shared history spanned 15 years, a tapestry woven with shared dreams, laughter, and the comfortable rhythm of a life well lived, or so I thought. The foundation of that tapestry, however, had just been revealed as nothing more than flimsy threads, ready to unravel at the slightest tug. The AirTag was a stroke of accidental genius, a small, unassuming device I'd misplaced in his golf bag weeks prior, ostensibly to track his expensive clubs. Who knew it would become the unwitting cartographer of his clandestine rendezvous? On that particular Tuesday, a wave of mundane curiosity had prompted me to check its location. Julian had claimed he was at a client meeting across town, a plausible enough alibi for a busy realtor. Yet, the small blue dot on my screen stubbornly insisted he was parked discreetly behind the community's rarely used tennis courts, a location far from any commercial district, and suspiciously close to Penelope Shaw's sprawling Mediterranean-style villa. Penelope Shaw. The name alone conjured images of perfectly coiffed hair, designer athleisure wear, and an uncanny ability to transform any HOA meeting into a gladiatorial arena for soccer mom drama. She was the self-appointed arbiter of all things proper and suburban, often directing her microaggressions my way, subtly criticizing my unconventional approach to parenting or my relaxed gardening style. Now, her disdain felt less like a personality quirk and more like a carefully constructed smokescreen. A cold dread, sharp and precise, began to prickle at the edges of my composure. It wasn't the gut-wrenching, tearful despair one might expect. Instead, it was a chilling clarity, a sudden, almost clinical understanding of the true landscape of my marriage. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my soul, navigated to Julian's phone, which he'd carelessly left charging on his nightstand. He had a habit of being lax with his digital security, a fatal flaw for a man with so many secrets. There, nestled amongst mundane work emails and group chat notifications, were the damning prints. Text messages, photos, and timestamps that painted a vivid, undeniable picture of an affair. "Can't wait for our HOA committee meeting tomorrow, Julian," one read, accompanied by a suggestive emoji that left nothing to the imagination. Another, a photo of Penelope, not in her usual pristine tennis whites, but in something far more revealing, captioned simply, "Thinking of you." The dates and times were meticulously logged, a digital diary of betrayal spanning months, not weeks. Each message was a fresh cut, each image a brutal confirmation of the hollow charade I had been living. Julian, with his practiced charm and an innate ability to make everyone feel like the most important person in the room, was indeed a master illusionist. His $1 million smile was merely a prop, a dazzling distraction from the 10-cent character lurking beneath. He was a man who thrived on external validation, a trait I had once found endearing, mistaking it for ambition. Now, it was clear it was merely a bottomless pit of ego, constantly seeking to be filled, regardless of the cost to others. And Penelope, the queen of our local social hierarchy, who wielded passive-aggressive comments like tiny poisoned darts, suddenly made perfect sense. Her incessant complaints about my slightly overgrown lavender bushes at the last HOA meeting, her thinly veiled critiques of my choice to work from home rather than volunteer for every school fundraiser, they weren't just petty grievances. They were the desperate attempts of a woman trying to assert dominance over a perceived rival, a rival she was simultaneously deceiving. The balance of our family, the quiet equilibrium I had so carefully nurtured, was nothing but a cruel joke, a stage for their clandestine performances. The initial shock quickly gave way to a simmering, volcanic rage, but it was a cold, controlled fury, not a destructive one. There would be no hysterics, no tearful confrontations in the privacy of our perfectly appointed master bedroom. No, Julian and Penelope had chosen to conduct their sordid little drama on the public stage of our community, and I intended to give them an audience they would never forget. My mind, usually occupied with color palettes and fabric textures, began to construct a new kind of design project, a meticulously orchestrated downfall. The upcoming HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Monday, September 23rd, suddenly transformed from a tedious discussion about mailbox colors into the perfect venue for my grand unveiling. The thought of turning a mundane debate into a dumpster fire of betrayal brought a grim, almost exhilarating smile to my lips. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my narrative, about shattering their illusions with the same brutal honesty they had shown me. The audience, I decided, was guaranteed to be captive. The week leading up to the HOA meeting felt less like a countdown to a suburban gathering and more like a meticulously planned heist. My internal monologue had transformed into a stand-up routine, each observation about Julian and Penelope a perfectly timed punchline, delivered to an audience of one, me. The initial shock had solidified into a calm, almost surgical resolve. There was no room for tears or self-pity. Those were luxuries I couldn't afford if I wanted to execute this with the precision it deserved. Instead, I channeled my energy into the kind of obsessive detail usually reserved for high-stakes interior design projects. Every interaction with Julian became a masterclass in passive-aggressive acting. "How was your client meeting it, honey?" I'd ask, a saccharine sweetness coating my words, knowing full well his client had been Penelope, likely discussing the optimal angle for illicit parking behind the tennis courts. His oblivious responses, full of vague platitudes about market trends and closing deals, only fueled my resolve. He was so confident in his deception, so utterly convinced of his own cleverness, it was almost comical. Almost. Penelope, meanwhile, continued her reign as the self-appointed queen of our gated community. I saw her at the Starbucks drive-thru, ordering her usual elaborate latte, probably strategizing her next HOA complaint. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows, usually arched in judgment, now seemed to me like tiny, venomous caterpillars. I even overheard her at Whole Foods, loudly discussing the decline in community standards with another soccer mom, her voice dripping with the kind of faux concern that only truly privileged people can master. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a butter knife and served it with her organic kale salad. These microaggressions, once irritating, now felt like fuel for my fire. Her subtle digs about my bohemian gardening choices or my unconventional approach to school fundraisers were no longer just annoying. They were part of a larger, insidious pattern of control and hypocrisy. She was a hot mess disguised as perfection, a train wreck waiting to happen, and I was about to be the conductor. My plan wasn't just about revealing the affair. It was about exposing the sheer absurdity of their carefully constructed lives. I decided to leverage my professional skills. As an interior designer, I was adept at creating visual narratives, at making spaces tell a story. This time, the story would be Julian and Penelope's, and the space would be the sterile, fluorescent-lit community clubhouse, usually reserved for potlucks and tedious budget discussions. I spent hours compiling the evidence, not just the explicit texts and photos, but also the more mundane, almost innocent-looking exchanges that, in context, screamed betrayal. A text from Julian. "Thinking of you, P. Can't wait for our strategy session later." Penelope's reply. "Me too, Jay. My husband is out playing golf with Owen. The coast is clear." Owen, her husband, the HOA treasurer, a man so engrossed in spreadsheets and property values, he wouldn't notice a wildfire in his own backyard. The thought of him, oblivious, while his wife was plotting her next rendezvous, sparked a fresh wave of indignation, mingled with a dark, satisfying humor. I created a presentation, complete with slides and bullet points, titled Community Standards, a Case Study in Ethical Violations. It was designed to look like a legitimate HOA proposal, a Trojan horse of suburban scandal. The first slide was innocuous, maintaining the integrity of our gated community. The second, however, would feature a blurry, zoomed-in photo of Julian's SUV parked behind the tennis courts, with the AirTag's location ping superimposed. Underneath, a sarcastic caption, "Julian Croft's client meeting location, an unconventional choice for real estate transactions." Each subsequent slide would peel back a layer of their deception, revealing snippets of their conversations, carefully redacted to avoid anything explicit, but leaving enough breadcrumbs for the audience to connect the dots. I even included a slide with a timeline, charting their extracurricular activities against Julian's business trips and Penelope's volunteer work. The narrative was clear. These two had been playing the community for fools, and I was about to spill the tea in the most public, humiliating way possible. The day of the HOA meeting, Monday, September 23rd, dawned with a crisp, almost celebratory air. I dressed impeccably, a subtle nod to my professional persona, projecting an aura of calm competence. Julian, completely unaware, even complimented my outfit. "Looking sharp, Margot," he said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek, a gesture that now felt like a grotesque pantomime. I nearly choked on my coffee, but managed a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "Just trying to make a good impression," I replied, the subtext heavy enough to sink a battleship. The clubhouse was buzzing with the usual pre-meeting chatter. Neighbors discussing property values, complaining about the rising cost of HOA fees, and, of course, the perennial debate about the community's mailbox colors. Penelope, radiating an air of self-importance, was already holding court near the refreshment table, her voice carrying across the room as she recounted some minor grievance about a neighbor's unapproved garden gnome. Owen, her husband, was meticulously arranging his financial reports at the head table, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked like the embodiment of suburban stability, utterly oblivious to the impending earthquake. As the meeting began, I sat quietly, observing the scene, a predator in plain sight. The initial agenda items droned on: budget reports, landscaping updates, the hotly contested mailbox color debate. Julian, ever the charmer, made a few comments about property values, his voice smooth and confident. Penelope, predictably, launched into a tirade about the aforementioned garden gnome, her indignation reaching operatic levels. The room was filled with the familiar hum of suburban discontent, a symphony of minor grievances. Then, it was my turn. I had signed up to speak under new business, ostensibly to discuss a community beautification project. I walked to the front of the room, a USB drive clutched in my hand, and plugged it into the projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying my meticulously crafted title slide, Community Standards, a Case Study in Ethical Violations. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the room. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Penelope, mid-sentence about the gnome, paused, her eyes narrowing. The game, as they say, was officially on. The first slide, with Julian's SUV and the AirTag ping, appeared. The room went silent. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. This was going to be a period moment, a declaration that their reign of hypocrisy was over. The silence in the clubhouse after my first slide hit the screen wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of deafening hush you get right before a train wreck unfolds, or when someone accidentally drops a full tray of Thanksgiving gravy. Julian, bless his oblivious heart, actually sputtered. "Margot, what in the actual hell are you doing?" he hissed, his face a fascinating shade of puce. Penelope, who moments before had been pontificating on the egregious offense of a garden gnome, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, then chased it with a shot of pure indignation. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to stiffen, a silent testament to the shock. Owen, her husband, the man whose primary concern was the community's fiscal health, merely blinked, his eyes slowly moving from the screen to his wife, then to Julian, a dawning horror spreading across his usually placid features. It was a masterpiece of suburban tableau, and I, the unassuming interior designer, was the conductor of this chaotic symphony. "Just providing a little community beautification, Julian," I replied, my voice calm, almost serene, in stark contrast to the internal fireworks display. "Thought we could all benefit from a transparent discussion about, well, community standards." I clicked to the next slide. This one featured a screenshot of Julian's phone, a text from Penelope. "Can't wait for our HOA committee meeting tomorrow, Julian." And Julian's reply, "Me neither, P. My client just canceled, so I'm free all afternoon." The emojis were a dead giveaway, even for the most naive among our neighbors. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a low murmur that quickly escalated into a cacophony of whispers. "Oh, honey, that's sus," someone muttered, loud enough for me to hear. Penelope finally found her voice, a high-pitched shriek. "Margot, this is slander. This is a private matter." "Private?" I raised an eyebrow, a gesture I'd perfected over years of dealing with demanding clients. "When your private matters involve my husband, my children's father, and the HOA treasurer's wife, conducted on community property, I'd say it becomes a matter of public interest, especially when you're both so vocal about maintaining the integrity of our neighborhood." I clicked again. This time, it was a photo from Julian's camera roll, clearly taken by Penelope. It was a selfie of her, not in her usual pristine tennis whites, but in a less-than-modest outfit, captioned, "Thinking of you, Jay." The date and timestamp were undeniable. Julian finally stood up, his face a mask of panicked rage. "Margot, you can't do this. This is completely out of line." "Out of line?" I echoed, a sardonic smile playing on my lips. "Like finding your husband's second family on Facebook isn't what they mean by expanding your social network? Or discovering your wife's volunteer work involves intimate strategy sessions with the real estate agent next door?" "I'd say I'm just correcting the alignment, darling." The room was a dumpster fire of gossip and outrage. Owen Shaw, Penelope's husband, had gone from merely blinking to staring at his wife with a look of utter bewilderment, as if she had suddenly sprouted a second head. Penelope, meanwhile, was frantically trying to gather her composure, her face a blotchy mess of shame and fury. "This is a setup. She's lying," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Oh, am I?" I asked, my voice still dangerously calm. "Because the metadata on these photos and texts tells a different story. And speaking of stories, let's talk about Julian's business trips to Phoenix every other Thursday. Turns out, those weren't just about closing deals. They were also about closing in on Penelope at a discreet little Airbnb she rented under a fake name." I paused for dramatic effect, letting the information sink in. "And here's the kicker, folks," I continued, clicking to a new slide. This was the crucial discovery, the one that elevated this from mere marital drama to a full-blown community scandal. Julian, in his infinite wisdom, decided to use some of his commission from these client meetings to pay for Penelope's little love nest. And guess what? He's been expensing those travel costs through his real estate business. Business expenses for an affair. I believe that's what the IRS calls tax fraud, or at the very least, questionable accounting practices. A collective gasp, louder than before, reverberated through the room. Tax fraud. That word hit harder than any infidelity. In our community, where financial propriety was next to godliness, This was a cardinal sin. Julian's face went from puce to a sickly shade of green. Owen Shaw, who had been quietly absorbing the betrayal of his wife, suddenly looked like he'd been hit by a truck. His eyes, now wide with a new kind of horror, darted to Julian, then back to the slide, which now displayed screenshots of bank transfers and expense reports, all meticulously highlighted. Owen, I believe you, as the HOA treasurer, might find this particularly illuminating, I said, a hint of steel entering my voice. Considering Julian also forgot to disclose a few significant upgrades he made to his own property, using funds that mysteriously appeared around the same time as these business expenses. Funny how that works, right? The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing, and demanding answers. Julian was stammering, trying to deny everything, but his words were lost in the chaos. Penelope had dissolved into a puddle of tears and incoherent accusations. My plan wasn't just about exposing their affair. It was about dismantling their entire carefully constructed facade, brick by painful brick. I had spent days poring over Julian's business accounts, cross-referencing dates, and digging into public records. It turned out that Julian, in his hubris, had been cutting corners not just in his personal life, but in his professional one too, using his real estate company as a personal piggy bank for his illicit activities. The crucial discovery wasn't just the affair, but the financial malfeasance tied directly to it, making it a matter for the entire community and potentially the authorities. So, while Julian and Penelope were busy playing house behind the tennis courts, I continued, raising my voice to be heard above the din, I was busy doing a little interior design of my own, rearranging the furniture, so to speak. And it turns out, the foundation of their little love nest was built on a rather shaky financial structure. I projected my final slide for this segment, a screenshot of an email I had already sent. I've taken the liberty of forwarding all this evidence to Owen as HOA treasurer, and also to a certain friend of mine at the IRS, who I'm sure will find Julian's creative accounting practices quite fascinating. And yes, my divorce attorney has also received a copy. I paused, letting the full weight of my words hang in the air. Because turns out, "Till death do us part" doesn't cover finding your replacement and then funding their rendezvous with tax-deductible shenanigans. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. A stunned, horrified quiet. Julian looked like he was about to faint. Penelope was sobbing uncontrollably. Owen, his face pale, was already scrolling through his phone, likely verifying the email I'd sent. This wasn't just a revelation. It was a full-blown tactical strike. They had underestimated me, the quiet interior designer, mistaking my composure for weakness. They had seen me as merely a prop in their suburban drama, but I was about to rewrite the entire script. The satisfaction was a warm, potent rush, a period moment of epic proportions. The stage was set, the audience was captivated, and the next act promised to be even more devastating. The HOA clubhouse, usually a bastion of passive-aggressive politeness and perfectly manicured lawns, had officially transformed into a dumpster fire of epic proportions. Julian, my soon-to-be ex-husband, stood there, mouth agape, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a very expensive SUV. Penelope, bless her heart, had moved beyond mere tears to full-blown snot and sobs hysterics, a performance worthy of a daytime Emmy. The murmurs from the assembled neighbors had escalated into a full-blown roar, a symphony of, "I knew it," and, "Oh honey, that's a hot mess." I just stood by the projector, a serene smile on my face, watching my carefully constructed house of cards, or rather Julian and Penelope's house of lies, come crashing down. It was period. "Margot, you can't be serious," Julian finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking like a cheap porcelain vase. "This is a misunderstanding. A huge, terrible misunderstanding." "Oh, I assure you, Julian," I replied, my voice dripping with the kind of sweetness usually reserved for a Southern belle at a church social. "There's no misunderstanding here. The screenshots, the bank transfers, the metadata, they're all speaking a very clear language. And that language, darling, is tax fraud and adultery. Pretty universal, I'd say. Owen Shaw, Penelope's husband and the HOA treasurer, had finally found his voice, though it was a low, dangerous rumble. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on Julian, then on Penelope, who was now clinging to him, wailing about how I was ruining her life. "Owen, I've already sent you the full dossier," I interjected, making sure everyone could hear, including the creative accounting Julian used to fund Penelope's little love nest, and some rather interesting discrepancies in his reported income versus his actual expenditures. "I'm sure your fiduciary duties as treasurer will compel you to look into it." And just like that, the first domino fell. The next morning, the neighborhood gossip was hotter than a Texas summer. Julian's phone, I later heard, was ringing off the hook, not with clients but with calls from his partners, demanding explanations. His real estate firm, Prestige Properties, suddenly found its prestige plummeting faster than a lead balloon. The friend at the IRS, who was actually a former college roommate now working in tax enforcement, wasted no time. A formal audit notice landed on Julian's doorstep faster than a pizza delivery on a Friday night. His business trips to Phoenix were now under a microscope, and those client meetings at the Airbnb? They were looking less like legitimate deductions and more like a one-way ticket to a very uncomfortable conversation with Uncle Sam. The consequences were swift and devastating, and frankly, hilarious. Julian, who prided himself on his deal-making prowess, suddenly found himself unable to close a door, let alone a multi-million-dollar property. Clients who valued discretion and integrity above all else in our affluent suburb started pulling out faster than you could say, foreclosure. His carefully cultivated image as the pillar of the community crumbled, replaced by whispers of hot mess and train wreck. He tried to spin it, of course, posting vague Facebook updates about personal challenges and unjust accusations, but the internet, much like a hungry shark, had already smelled blood. The comment section was a spill the tea fest, with neighbors subtly, and not so subtly, referencing HOA meetings and Phoenix getaways. Penelope's downfall was equally satisfying, though perhaps more socially brutal. Her perfectly curated life as the queen of the country club evaporated. Her book club suddenly had an opening. Her charity committee decided to go in a new direction, and her daily Starbucks run became a gauntlet of averted gazes and whispered judgment. Owen, her husband, a man whose patience was legendary, filed for divorce within the week. He wasn't a man for public drama, but he was a man for financial rectitude. The betrayal, especially the financial one, was a bridge too far. He cited irreconcilable differences and financial impropriety, a subtle nod to Julian's tax fraud that resonated deeply within our financially conscious community. Penelope, who had always relied on Owen's wealth and status, was suddenly facing life without her gilded cage. Her retail therapy sessions now involved looking at clearance racks, not designer boutiques. It was a beautiful thing to behold. My divorce from Julian, meanwhile, became surprisingly straightforward. With the IRS breathing down his neck and his business in freefall, Julian was desperate to settle. My attorney, a sharp-as-a-tack woman named Brenda, used Julian's financial malfeasance as leverage, securing a settlement that was far more favorable than I could have ever dreamed. I got the house, a generous alimony package, at least until his assets were fully seized by the government, and a substantial chunk of his liquidated business assets. Turns out, I told Brenda over celebratory margaritas, karma decided to become my business partner after all. The new normal for Julian was a stark contrast to his former glory. He eventually lost his real estate license. His assets were frozen, and he was forced to sell his lavish suburban house, the very one he had forgotten to disclose upgrades on, to cover his mounting legal fees and tax penalties. He moved into a cramped apartment downtown, a far cry from his golf course views. Penelope, after her divorce from Owen, found herself without the country club membership, the luxury car, or the social standing she had so meticulously built. She tried to move to a different suburb, hoping for a fresh start, but in the age of social media, reputations precede you. She became a cautionary tale, a train wreck meme in human form. But here's the kicker. The unexpected twist that truly cemented the poetic justice. Owen Shaw, Penelope's ex-husband, a man I had initially pitied, turned out to be a quiet force of nature. During his own divorce proceedings, fueled by a righteous indignation I hadn't anticipated, he dug deeper into Julian's business dealings. Turns out, Julian's creative accounting wasn't just limited to his affair. He had been skimming profits, overcharging clients, and even manipulating HOA funds for years. Owen, with his meticulous financial mind, unearthed a veritable treasure trove of evidence that led to Julian facing not just tax fraud charges, but also embezzlement. The man who had been so obsessed with appearances and financial gain lost everything due to his own greed and recklessness. It was a beautiful, symmetrical kind of ruin. I, on the other hand, was thriving. My interior design business, once overshadowed by Julian's successful real estate career, was booming. Clients, particularly women, admired my strength and resilience. They saw me as someone who wouldn't take any crap, someone who could transform not just a living room, but a whole life. I even got a few commissions from people who had been at that fateful HOA meeting, wanting me to redecorate their lives, so to speak. The humor in it all was that Julian and Penelope, in their pathetic attempts to maintain their facade, had inadvertently given me the greatest marketing campaign of my career. My life became a reality show I never auditioned for, but I was definitely winning the ratings. The satisfaction was palpable, a deep, resonant hum of vindication. I hadn't resorted to violence or petty revenge. I had simply exposed the truth, and the truth, in its own quiet, devastating way, had done all the heavy lifting. Watching Julian and Penelope fall from their self-made pedestals was like watching a perfectly executed comedy sketch where the punchline was their own undoing. They thought they were playing a sophisticated game of suburban chess, but I was playing a different game entirely, one where the rules were fair, the evidence was undeniable, and the consequences were absolutely deliciously final. Looking back, it's funny how life throws you a curveball, and you think it's going to strike you out, but really, it's just setting you up for a grand slam. My surprise party of betrayal wasn't the end. It was just the most dramatic, public, and frankly, hilarious beginning of my real life. I used to think the American dream was about the perfectly manicured lawn, the two-car garage, and the husband who brings you flowers on your anniversary. Turns out, it's actually about realizing that sometimes the only way to get your dream life is to burn the old one down, metaphorically speaking, of course. And then, from the ashes, you build something even better, preferably with a better view and no hidden Airbnbs. The wisdom I've acquired? It's less about enlightenment and more about a finely tuned BS detector. I learned that appearances are everything is a mantra for people who have nothing real to show for themselves. Julian and Penelope, with their meticulously crafted facades, were so busy performing for the neighborhood, they forgot to actually live. They were like those perfectly staged houses you see on Zillow. Beautiful on the outside, but you just know the plumbing is questionable and there's a weird smell in the basement. My life used to be that house. Now it's a fixer-upper I'm renovating myself. And let me tell you, the foundation is solid. The irony of it all is almost too good to be true. Julian, who always bragged about his financial acumen and his empire, is now navigating the labyrinthine world of tax audits and legal battles, probably wishing he'd paid more attention in his business ethics class. Or, just not committed fraud. His prestige is now a punchline, and his network consists mostly of lawyers and IRS agents. He's living proof that you can't outrun karma, especially when karma has a good internet connection and a penchant for public humiliation. He's probably still trying to figure out how I, the little wife he so easily dismissed, managed to orchestrate his downfall with nothing but a few screenshots and a well-placed friend. Bless his oblivious heart. Penelope. Oh, Penelope. The queen of the country club is now just Penelope. No crown, no club, no Owen. Her carefully curated social circle has dissolved faster than a sugar cube in hot coffee. She tried to join a new book club in a neighboring town, but apparently, word travels faster than a speeding Tesla in the suburbs. The last I heard, she was trying to sell artisanal scented candles online, which, let's be honest, is peak desperate housewife trying to find herself energy. It's almost sad, if I weren't so busy enjoying my new, unburdened life. Almost. Owen, on the other hand, surprised everyone. After his divorce, he didn't just lick his wounds. He became a local legend. He sold his house, bought a sleek downtown condo, and started dating a woman who actually appreciated his dry wit and his encyclopedic knowledge of municipal bonds. He even sent me a bottle of really expensive champagne after Julian's embezzlement charges went public, with a note that simply read, "Justice served. Cheers." Owen, the quiet, meticulous man, found his roar, and it was glorious. It just goes to show, you never truly know what's simmering beneath the surface of a perfectly polite suburbanite. As for me, Margot Hayes, I'm not just surviving, I'm thriving. My interior design business is flourishing. I'm designing spaces that reflect genuine happiness, not just aspirational perfection. I've embraced the hot mess that life threw at me and turned it into my brand. I host Girls' Night at my house, the one Julian paid for, and we spill the tea about everything from bad dates to HOA horror stories. I've learned that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, dusting yourself off, and maybe, just maybe, making sure the people who pushed you down trip on their way out. The biggest takeaway? Don't ever let anyone make you feel small, invisible, or like a supporting character in your own story. Especially not a man who thinks he's God's gift to real estate, and a woman whose entire personality is her perfectly coiffed hair. My life isn't a tragedy, it's a dark comedy, and I'm the lead, writing my own punchlines. And trust me, they're always delivered with a smile. So if you ever find yourself in a similar train wreck situation, remember this. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with a side of public records, a dash of social media exposure, and a whole lot of sarcastic commentary. And always, always make sure you're the one holding the remote. Turns out, my happily ever after started the moment I stopped trying to fit into someone else's script.